Proper execution of justice has been necessary for the survival of all civilizations throughout time. Justice governs the distinction between good and evil. Whoever controls the interpretation of justice can do what they please to their fellow men. In Anne Dillard's For the Time Being, she presents the motif of justice in two separate ways, human and divine. Through the sections of Sand, Evil, Israel, and Thinker, Dillard reveals the purpose of man in interpreting and executing God's judgment of moral evil and sin. The character of God particularly demonstrates several interpretations of justice. Since God himself cannot be completely proven, the view of justice stemming from him can be seen in several ways. The world we know, filled with both good and evil, was formed when God contracted himself to make room for a finite world. With God removing himself from the world, he removed himself from human affairs. The only true guidance for his view of justice would come in holy works, biblical texts, and mystical prophets, all of which are extremely difficult to interpret. The human mind then evokes two different views of God. God as a Newtonian God who sits on the throne of judgment, frowning and figuring, dishing out human fates, to teach, dazzle, rebuke, or try us one by one, and the uncaring God, a being no more blinding people with glaucoma, or testing them with diabetes, or purifying them with spinal pain, or choreographing the seeding of tumor cells, than he is at jimmying floodwaters or pitching tornadoes at towns. These two contrasting views of gods largely influence the determination of justice. For what is truly better, to follow the words of a caring God or to listen to yourself in the face of an empty universe?
There is a distinct contrast between the justice man undertakes, such as laws and moral codes, and the judgments made by God, or rather lack thereof. Dillard states on page 26 that in 135 CE, the Romans killed Rabbi Avica for teaching Torah by flaying his skin and stripping his bones. This statement exemplifies one of mankind's extreme and cruel punishments. Oftentimes, when these punishments are executed, they do not take into consideration God's own judgment. Man applies his own laws and moral codes rather than listening to God's will, and that is an issue Dillard repeatedly addresses throughout the novel. According to page 179, when scholars presented Jesus with a prostitute and demanded she be stoned, he simply told them to let God first cast a stone at her. When no harm came to the prostitute, Jesus sent her on her way. This anecdote stresses that while man may demand punishment, God may not will such upon the guilty. Through this fact, Dillard raises a very important question regarding divine justice. Who are we to act as God's hand? How do we know for sure that we are being true to God's will? It is up to man to keep these questions in mind and always question if our judgments are in line with the Almighty and act accordingly. Furthermore, Dillard addresses how God implements justice upon humanity through the rhetorical question, did the priest think God rewards virtue? As seen on page 102. While man bases judgments on a good versus evil scale, Dillard stresses that God neither rewards nor punishes man for their doings. In fact, Dillard reveals that God does not follow what we, as man, believe to be justice. Instead, he chooses not to intervene, and rather our own existence and the course life takes us through, the bad and the good, is justice enough.
Although God does not intervene with the moral interpretation of his will, it is evident that without the vessel of man himself, God would be unable to affect the world altogether. Rather, he utilizes mankind as the connection between the spiritual realm and reality, leaving them with the responsibility of embodying his justice. The belief that God needs mankind is referenced throughout the book. For instance, on page 195 of the subsection Thinker, Dillard discusses how God needs man to disclose him, complete him, and fulfill him, revealing man to be more than just subservient to God. This implies both that mankind relies on God for guidance, and God relies on mankind to represent his force in the physical world. Without mankind to observe his judgment, God's justice would not be noticed by humanity. Not only does mankind convey God's final judgment, but they act as his sole connection to the world. Without them, God would be unable to witness their reality altogether. Dillard backs this statement on page 196, where she quotes Lawrence Kushner stating, "Our hands are God's. It is up to us what God will see and hear, up to us what God will do." This concludes that God's sense of the world and what is ultimately decided is dependent on what he sees from the perspective of humanity. The judgment of the world is thus resultant of what God perceives of humanity. If humans do not live honest and diligent lives, then God may punish them. However, this divine justice is limited by the eyes of mankind. Hence, the justice of God will only be based on reaction to man's choices rather than some sort of spiritual premonition. Through this process, it is concluded that man plays an essential role in determining God's actions by influencing his views. This is supported by page 52 of the section Israel, where Dillard states that a pious person can hasten redemption and help mend heaven and earth. By living with virtue, they may fulfill God's expectations and thus spare the world from his justice. Their positive connection to God solidifies the relationship between judgment and sin. If humans are able to follow God's will or live without sin, then his justice is unnecessary and thus does not appear in the world. However, because moral evil has always existed in humanity, likewise has God's justice continued to thrive. Thus, God and man have always held a close connection in exemplifying divine justice.